This is the first screencast for Unit 3, and it will deal with the first two sessions, 2 out of 3 sessions. The whole of Unit 3 covers from the 1590s to 1785. This screencast will cover the context and background for the 17th century, although it starts a little bit before that and will end a little bit before the end of the century. John Donne, George Herbert, and John Milton will be the poets we'll study from this first half of Unit 3, first two-thirds, really. Donne and Herbert together in Session 1 as the metaphysical poets, and John Milton on his own, the great epic poet of post-Anglo-Saxon Britain, in his own session in Session 2. John Donne is born in 1572 and is writing by his mid-20s, which means that along with being a contemporary of late Shakespeare, remember Shakespeare publishes Othello and Macbeth, or produces Othello and Macbeth and King Lear and Coriolanus and The Tempest and others during the last 10 years of his career from 1603 to 1613, actually after Elizabeth has died. By that time, most of the early writers that Shakespeare is associated with are gone, and a new generation has replaced them, including Thomas Nash and Thomas Campion. Francis Bacon, who in addition to being the prominent scientist that he was and promoter of the scientific method, was the first major English essayist. A number of women, including Mary Cavendish and Amelia Lanier, Mary Roth, and others, who would begin to accustomize the public to women publishing, and would lead to the opportunity for a number of women to have literary careers during the 17th century. And Ben Jonson continues through this latter part of Shakespeare's career into the 17th century. Like Donne, he was very interested in classical models, and between them and several other writers, many classical models were introduced quite formally as models to the English language. When Queen Elizabeth died, two very important periods came to an end. One was the Tudor dynasty. Her heir, her relative, her cousin, James VI of Scotland, who would peacefully take the throne as James I of England, was far enough removed that he was not a Tudor. He is considered the start of his own dynasty, the Stuarts. In addition, Elizabeth had ruled very successfully, dealing with all kinds of religious conflict, and for the most part peacefully sorting it out. It's not to say she didn't persecute the side she didn't like as much. A little bit she did, more than a little, but she was a capable ruler who walked a tightrope in those areas. James I did not enjoy the domestic peace that Elizabeth did. Technically, there was not war, but he was in far more conflict with his people, various religious groups, and with Parliament than Elizabeth. Partially, this was because James was a devotee of the divine right of kings. He wrote on the subject and moved toward personal autocratic rule throughout his reign. James considered himself a patron of the arts. He was Shakespeare's patron through his last 10 years in London, and he wrote and published on his own during his reign. In a preview of the political and religious turmoil to come, James nearly gets blown up along with Parliament by Guy Fawkes, but Fawkes and his fellow radical Catholics are caught, and they become the source of one of England's favorite political holidays, where Guy Fawkes is burned in effigy every 5th of November. Charles, James's son, followed him as king. There were rumors about Charles's Catholicism, or at least Catholic leanings, just like there had been about his dad. It doesn't seem to be any more true of Charles than it was of James, necessarily, at least in any provable fashion. But Charles acted even more on the divine right of kings than his father had. He and Congress were in conflict, and so he dismissed Parliament, and eventually tried to rule without them. But Parliament had so long been established as the collector of taxes and had all the mechanisms for that. And so Charles ended up bankrupt and couldn't get the money he needed without recalling Congress. So he recalls Congress, and immediately conflict starts up again and the battle lines are drawn. Congress, or Parliament, and the made up largely of radical Puritans and the rising bourgeoisie, formed an army led by Oliver Cromwell. And the king went to the nobles and called up an army um, that was there to enforce his opinion. Cromwell beat the king in two different periods of fighting, and after the second, Parliament had Charles I tried and executed for crimes against the English people. They initially institute a Commonwealth Republic, but very quickly turned to Cromwell as Lord Protector, which essentially made him dictator for life. Cromwell was a forceful enough personality, and Parliament had enough power in the wake of the Civil War that he was able to rule for 9 years and to hold things together. Even though he did not even try for the balance Elizabeth found on religion, he was able to make it work. When he died, his son inherited his title of Lord Protector, but Richard was a minor disaster, and Congress eventually decided that they'd be better off going back to the Stuarts than sticking with Richard Cromwell. So Charles I, who they had executed, his boy and his wife had gone to Paris, and Charles II is invited back from Paris to be King of England. He returns with his family and his a court that had spent years in Paris and so you had a very Frankified court, a very French court, and people were very suspicious of Charles II because everybody knew that the French were Catholics. Um, Charles didn't make a whole lot of pushes that way and finishes out his reign with reasonable peace, but he has no kids, and he's followed by his brother James. And James made the same mistake Mary Tudor did, and being openly Roman Catholic himself, tried to force the country back to Catholicism, last English monarch to do so. James had so little support that Congress was able to go with the nobles' approval and invite Mary Stuart, the tie to the Stuart line, and her husband, Prince William of Orange, to come and rule England. And they did. And it was called the Glorious or Bloodless Revolution, and this was in 1685. John Donne starts off as very much a secular poet. He is the son of a prominent Catholic family who had been much picked on because of their Catholicism. And eventually, Donne would study and work it out and join the Anglican Church. He even wrote against Catholics to try to secure James I's favor. Um, but eventually he becomes Dean of St. Paul's, and in the end is known best for for a few love lyrics and his religious poetry and sermons. George Herbert was a country pastor who published a single volume of poetry. Posthumously, a friend published it for him. He had some secular verse, but he destroyed all of it on his deathbed. John Milton, perhaps the most educated of all English writers in the old classic Latin and Greek tradition, set out to write the great poem of the English language and wrote Paradise Lost, a Christian setting of the Homeric tradition that retold the Bible.